Hey there friends, welcome back to another Legally Armed America video. I'm of course Paul Glasgow here, the one and only truth pimp, dealing you a vulgar display of logic and reason on a daily basis. Today I'm going to expose shocking details of a story you're already familiar with, the 6-hour P320, but I'm going to explain to you how a major firearms manufacturer like SIG, top Pentagon officials, and senior Army acquisition leaders pushed a sidearm into the hands of the U.S. troops knowing the dangers it posed. First, guys, if you don't mind, check out my friends Durya. Durya makes some awesome handguns. This is a DY9. This is my new carry gun. They are obviously optics ready. You're going to be familiar with all of its Glock-like controls, so there will not be any relearning of how these things work. In fact, the internals are the same as well, so I don't know that you're going to be getting any drop or bump uncommanded discharges. But the DY9 is a sweet carry pistol, so take a look at it if you don't mind. I carry one daily and I highly recommend them. Again, the Durya DY9, what a sweet carry pistol. Guys, I feel the need to put this disclaimer out there first thing because I know there's going to be some crybabies in the comment section. And I'm cool with that. You guys help boost the algorithm, so roll in there and do your thing. Understand where I'm coming from. I'm coming from a standpoint of not only wanting to know the truth, but I'm a taxpayer. My taxpayer dollars paid for the approval of what now is looking like a somewhat and seemingly unsafe firearm for the military, for law enforcement, and guess what? You and I to carry. Now, this is not my opinion. This is based on things that have happened. Let me summarize a little bit for you. The 6-hour P320 selection as the U.S. military's modular handgun system, you've seen it as the acronym MHS, it was hailed as a leap forward in sidearm technology. But behind closed doors, Army leadership and civilian executives were made very much aware via SIG's own risk analysis that the SIG P320 could fire unintentionally due to internal failures, mechanical shock, or drops. Now, modifications made during the contract process were supposed to remove this risk, but independent government testing and hundreds of real-world incidents that you guys have all seen have proved otherwise, at least seemingly otherwise. Again, I don't have this proof, but you've seen it. Yet the Army's leadership not only proceeded with the contract, but kept critical details locked away from public scrutiny. Now, I say all that because everything that we've been seeing from different reports, whether it's YouTube content creators, news reports, whichever, all seem to focus on who? 6-hour. And I'm rightfully so. I mean, 6-hour is not devoid of any of the blame here, right? They, in fact, created the firearm. They sold it. They knew of the reports that we're talking about. I'm not happy with the fact that there are key people responsible for the rollout of this P320, not only in the military, but the image that it gives to the commercial buyers, you and I, and law enforcement for that matter. People that seem to be getting away with murder now, after the Air Force airman died, right? Was shot by the gun, seemingly, allegedly. Our military leaders are the ones who approved this. And guess what? They not only knew about this report that just came out, they mandate these reports to be given to them that they can look at. Now, I'm not going to go into all the detail of the report because there are other content creators that are going into that. I will tell you at a super high level that if you want, I'll post the link to it so you guys can see it. The title of it is The Document 6-Hour Doesn't Want You to See About the P320. A lot of really good information here. In a nutshell, and again, I don't see the guy's name anywhere on here. I know it comes from practicalshootinginsights.com, but I don't see the guy's name. He did a great job digging on this. And what he essentially did is he went and looked at different court filings based on SIG's involvement in different litigation. And he uncovered some stuff out there that has exposed unredacted files that show that not only 6-hour, who performed these required reports, failure type reports, not only does SIG disclose all this, but again, that was a requirement from the U.S. military to go through this whole MHS process. So this wasn't an internal document that SIG produced and then hid. It was a document required by the federal government, the military, the Department of Defense, that they required of SIG. So SIG and the military knew about this document that discloses all this. Now, there's tons to go through. Jared with Guns and Gadgets put out a really good video on this earlier today. I suggest you go take a look. He takes a more deep dive into what this report actually states. I'm more focused on who's at fault here, but one of the pages that drew my attention more than anything was page 7. It states, in the most recent filing submitted in a separate case currently in trial over an alleged uncommanded discharge of the P320, Sig Sauer is seeking to seal both the FMECA document and any testimony related to it. Now, the FMECA that they're talking about, that stands for Failure Modes, Effects, Criticality Analysis. Again, SIG wants to seal this document. They argue that, quote, the engineering details and decisions regarding how to minimize or eliminate potential causes of failure gives Sig Sauer a competitive advantage over its competition and trade secrets that would be highly prejudicial to Sig Sauer if exposed to the public. It goes on to say, additionally, as part of their motion, Sig Sauer included correspondence with the U.S. Army, which expressed the following position, quote, the Army position would be to oppose the distribution to the public of the FMECA document as it potentially reveals critical information about the handgun. So we're looking at Sig Sauer attorneys, obviously, and the U.S. military both wanting to suppress this report that shows they knew about and acknowledged the dangers as far back as 2017 of the P320, potentially firing inside of holster, being jiggled around, being dropped, whichever. In other words, not pulling of the trigger, which SIG said emphatically this gun will not fire without the pull of a trigger. That has since been abandoned, and this report right here shows why. Now again, my approach in this video is a little bit different than some of the others that you're going to see on this, because I'm not going to focus on this report, because all these other videos out there pointed out, I basically gave you it in a nutshell. It acknowledges the dangers that existed way back in 2017, right? My biggest problem is, again, people are going to beat SIG up on this, and rightfully so. They had all this information, as far back as 8 years ago or so. Somebody wrote a check from the federal government using your money and my money. Somebody approved all of this. Yes, SIG should be viewed to a certain degree as a villain in this whole process. If we're lumping all the blame on Sig Sauer, we are totally missing the picture here. We have people spending your money and my money on what they knew was a faulty gun in order to get their own promotions, get their own accolades, get their own awards as a result of a flawless rollout of a new handgun for our military. I identified 2 of these villains within the U.S. military that I'm going to share with you. Stephanie Easter is the first one. As the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, Easter was the Army's Chief Civilian Acquisition Executive during the decision to acquire the P320 from SIG. She oversaw and publicly endorsed the, quote, full and open competition, unquote, that led directly to them fielding the P320. Easter is now out of government and a top executive at CAES, a major defense industry supplier. Our next villain is Colonel Steve Power. Power was the Army's product manager for soldier weapons. He managed the MHS program, briefed Congress and the media, and signed off on critical deployment schedules. Today, however, Power continues to serve as project manager for armament systems in the Army's Acquisition Directorate. What did they approve? They approved a weapon that these 6-hour documents, the failure modes, effects, criticality analysis, detailing the risk of uncommanded discharges. Yeah, they approved that, which they had knowledge of and they had read. They knew of these vulnerabilities and a broader mechanical defect that could not be fully fixed by SIG's in-contract modifications. Still, these Army leaders fast-tracked the deployment of the P320 using your tax dollars. Guys, this isn't just about a defective gun, it's about accountability, both inside SIG and at the Pentagon. These 2 people misled the American public and Congress just for personal accolades and awards and personal gain, or professional gain, I should say, right? They had personal gain too, I'm sure. So let's look at our 2 villains and where they are now. The profile of Stephanie Easter in the Top ESG Execs to Watch in 2024 article paints her as a committed leader in corporate sustainability and diversity efforts at CAES, focusing on ambitious climate, diversity, and employment engagement initiatives. That's right, Easter doesn't work for the military anymore. She's in the private sector now, working for a defense contractor that has current contracts with the federal government. You see, by Easter presiding over this, quote, successful high-profile modernization program like the MHS program, she solidified her status as an effective leader in Pentagon procurement. That whole MHS program with the P320 was publicly touted as meeting urgent operational needs and replacing outdated equipment under her watch, which bolstered her professional reputation within the DoD. Obviously outside of it as well. Citing a blemish-free MHS rollout, this allowed Easter to maximize her professional advancement after government service. She transitioned to top executive roles in the private sector. Of course, she benefited from public image and corporate branding also, with the P320's issues muted or covered up or shielded, however you want to put it, from public scrutiny while she was in office. Easter maintained an image of competent leadership. She was considered an asset upon entering corporate America, especially in fields emphasizing ethics and responsible stewardship like ESG. That's the old environmental, social, and governance. Remember we talked one time about ESG scores, right? She's big on ESG type stuff. That's what her job is over there at CAES, is dealing with more ESG related stuff. Now, hopefully a lot of the DEI stripping out of the government type work is going to impact her and companies like this who pushed that to the forefront initially, because that was something that the Biden administration wanted to push and encourage companies to embrace. That likely is not going to carry the same amount of weight, but that certainly is what helped get her into her position at CAES. But by her not being publicly linked to the P320 issues, again, this is why I'm making this video, she has avoided direct congressional, legal, or media scrutiny. This has definitely shielded her from investigations or blame that could have halted or derailed her post or after military executive career. Now, shockingly, if you look at any of the accolades regarding Easter online, you know what's not mentioned? The P320. She benefited from it to get promotions within the military and then to leave the military and get a high-profile job in the private sector. But you don't look at her. Again, don't think there's nothing ironic going on here, but you certainly won't see that now. That was her claim to fame to get her where she's at. But she certainly ain't citing it now. She's pretty much reinvented herself and distanced herself from any of that accountability. Nowhere online, anywhere that I could find, does she address any of her significant role in the Army's procurement apparatus during major controversial defense contracts, including that of the P320. Now, if you look online, she just talks about her ESG leadership in the private sector. I mean, if the MHS deal was a successful firearm, like a good firearm, she would certainly be saying, that was me. She ain't talking about it now. Now, regarding Easter, there's still a lot that has to take place before, if nothing else, I'm putting a face to some of this with the U.S. military, but a lot has to happen before she gets in trouble, right? But this is a process, and I think it's going to get to that. Could this affect her in her current job? Yes, it could. Her current employer, CAES, which again, defense contractor, could face risks to its current and future military contracts that they currently have if the cover-up of the P320 dangers by Stephanie Easter, now a senior executive there, became the focal point of credible government or media scrutiny. There are contractor integrity requirements with the federal government, and if she's tied to this fraud or cover-up, gross misconduct in any kind of way, that's certainly going to hamper any kind of issues as long as she's on staff at a high-profile position at CAES. Congress could even get involved. I mean, let's look at it this way. The airman who lost his life, depending on whatever district a congressman or senator might be in that represented the airman who lost his life, Congress could actually go to the Department of Defense and say, this is a person that allowed this dangerous handgun, and again, I'm using their phrasing, to exist and be involved in the military. And they could actually require that she either leave the company or they maybe halt some of these contracts to CAES. Remember, the Pentagon and the Department of Justice could open an investigation into Easter's actions as a government official, and this could become subject to contract, quote, hold status on any of these contracts. Now, that's just her, right? There's another villain. This guy is still in the military, and he's still in significant roles in the military. Colonel Steve Power. His biography on the internet is quite impressive. It highlights a high-achieving career in military acquisitions, culminating in his role as project manager for individual weapons. This critical post put him directly in charge of major small arms programs, more specifically the modular handgun system. His leadership and rapid fielding of that MHS program were formally recognized by the Department of Defense. His subcompact weapon team received the prestigious 2019 David Packard Excellence in Acquisition Award, one of the highest honors for procurement officials, and he won the National Defense Industrial Association's 2014 Military Tester of the Year Award. By overseeing this rollout of the new P320, wildly celebrated by the Army as a major upgrade to the old, remember the M9 that Beretta had? Power built a reputation as a highly effective and efficient acquisition officer. In fact, the P320 acquisition paved the way for senior leadership assignments for him, such as the Enhanced Command Preparation Program at Joint Program Executive Office Armaments and Ammunition and the Pentagon. No wonder they use acronyms. In short, you can definitely tie the MHS P320 program as a direct personal accolade boost for Mr. Power. Oh, I'm sorry, Colonel Power. These are two people that knew about everything. Again, they required this report that SIG filled out that we have finally discovered as being unredacted, full of information that everybody knew what was going on. Again, I got to repeat, this was not a SIG report that they had internally that we have discovered and that the military can sit back and go, oh, we didn't know about that. No, they requested, it was a mandate from all of the people who submitted a firearm. We're talking about SIG, Glock, Beretta, FN, all these companies that submitted something to the MHS competition. This same report was required of them. I'm curious to know if anybody out there has access to the reports from these other companies, like the Glocks, like the FNs, like the Berettas. What does theirs say? Do they have this? In other words, I guess what I'm saying is, were there tiebreakers that these two military people had to come up with? If every single manufacturer had these same jiggling, uncommanded discharges and dropping, if they all had that, then I guess you could assume, well, all things are equal. But did they all have that? Was the SIG report the only one that had that information in there, yet these two people still selected it, right? You understand what I'm saying here? If all things are equal and everybody has the same danger involved with jiggling misfires and dropping, then okay, I guess I can kind of understand that. But if this was the only company and the only firearm that had that, and you still selected them, you knowingly selected a firearm that had reported and documented problems to it. Now, can any of this hurt either of these two people? Yes, it definitely can, now that this has been exposed. I do see that, especially with this video, we're finally getting some names associated with this. You know, we've been throwing SIG under the bus, and again, not saying that it's not necessary, but a lot of people have avoided scrutiny throughout this whole process because we focused on one company, the manufacturer of the firearm. There are people who work for these companies. There are people who work for the federal government who made these decisions. Those people need to be held accountable, right? Now that Easter isn't in the military, can this still hurt her? Yes, it can. With her not working for the government, there's almost no legal precedent for holding her, being a former high-ranking defense acquisition official, personally liable in civil court, right? Protections like sovereign immunity cover her actions during her official duties with the U.S. military, so she's definitely got some cover there, right? But that's unless there is concrete evidence of criminal misconduct like fraud or bribery. Those are very important to understand. She does have immunity from anything as long as she conducted herself the way it's supposed to be done. Again, with no criminal actions, no fraud, bribery. The bribery thing would probably, I think you could probably tie some of that if she received kickbacks or whatever, but sometimes those guys get really good at bribery when it comes to kickbacks and things like that. So that might be a tough one. But I do think that you can tie a certain amount of fraud to this. If you found an inherent danger in a product that you approved of and said that that inherent danger did not exist, I think that's fraud. I don't think she would have immunity from that because this now goes into the criminal action. And at that point, she could be held liable. In fact, if credible evidence emerges that fraud or bribery was involved in intentionally covering up the dangers of the P320, in fact, if credible evidence emerges that fraud or even bribery was involved in intentionally covering up the dangers of the P320, the consequences for anyone involved, whether it's her working for the federal government back then and not now, or even power for that matter, doesn't matter, private sector or government, the consequences could definitely be severe. In her case, it could be definitely criminal prosecution. Both fraud and bribery connected to federal procurement are serious federal crimes. Conviction can lead to massive fines, prison sentences even up to 15 years, and permanent disqualification from holding any government position, which at this point she doesn't need that, but you never know. This might be a future congressperson. I mean, she's doing all the things necessary to get a resume that's supposed to look impressive, right? So this certainly could hurt her there as well. I'm more concerned with the criminal stuff and sending her to prison if she in fact knew of these things, which likely she did because she approved all this and she requested the report. I don't see how she gets away from the whole fraud thing at this point. In fact, if it emerged that the coverage of P320 dangers was criminally suppressed, prior safety, fraud, or contract reviews and lawsuits could be reopened. I want to repeat that fraud and bribery are not protected by sovereign immunity. If someone like Stephanie Easter or another former official was found to have taken bribes or deliberately falsified documents to force the P320 through procurement, they would face investigation, indictment, and criminal charges. Remember, by her approval of that, she's acknowledging that it is safe for deployment. I'm talking about the P320. That's fraud. Again, it's important to have faces and names tied to this because we can demonize organizations and companies all we want. Somebody made these decisions. How about our boy over at the military? As a uniformed Army acquisitions officer responsible for the small arms programs like the P320, Colonel Power is highly unlikely to be held personally liable in civil litigation, regardless of newly exposed dangers or fatalities involving the weapon. There's something called the Ferres doctrine, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, where the U.S. military officers and government officials generally enjoy broad legal protections against personal civil liability for actions taken as part of their official duties. This is codified under sovereign immunity and the Ferres doctrine, which prevents personal lawsuits against federal officials for military-related decisions, even if harm results. Now, again, all of that is if he did not knowingly do something that would be considered fraud. In this case, I think he did. If credible evidence emerges that Colonel Powers participated in or enabled fraud or bribery to cover up the dangers of the P320, he would also face extremely serious consequences, both as a current Army officer and individually. As stated before, federal law treats fraud and bribery in defense procurement as major crimes. Penalties can include prison time, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of retirement benefits, heavy fines, and repayment of government losses. Prosecution is frequently pursued against military officials found to have accepted bribes, falsified documents, or deliberately concealed procurement. Regarding this, falsifying documents, unless it states we're okay with implementing a faulty or unsafe firearm, then he would have had to falsify documents because he would have approved something from a report that stated it was inherently unsafe. Even at a low percentage, it doesn't matter. It had proof in the report that he requested that showed that the P320 could fire defectively in an unsafe manner. So again, unless one of the requirements that was that we want an unsafe firearm that can fire with an uncommanded discharge, unless that was a requirement, he approved something that he knowingly knew was unsafe. So there could be consequences. Again, there are legal things that are going to have to take place. One of the big questions out there might be, you might be thinking this, okay, the military is big. These two people were in charge of this MHS project, right? But did they really know what was going on? In other words, the military is so big. Did they delegate that to somebody else? So did they really know about this faulty P320? As the senior acquisition executive, Easter and product manager for individual weapons, Power, both were in key roles to review and see and analyze these reports. It would have been standard procedure for these reports to come across their desks. In fact, it was their job to approve them. Public reporting, including lawsuits, strongly suggests that the Army program leadership, meaning Powers and Easters, were aware of documented significant failure modes in the P320 design and required, quote, mitigations before fielding. So they acknowledged the problems with the P320 and told SIG to correct them. So just by acknowledgement of that, they said, we know this thing can misfire, fix it. These are the people who told them to fix it. Now, there's pretty strong indication based on what I stated earlier that this was a redacted report that was never supposed to see the light of day. Parts of this report were deliberately redacted or withheld from wider circulation. In fact, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but there is a lawsuit by 6 Hour to make sure that this document never sees the light of day. Well, it's here now. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. It's out. So they may as well get rid of that lawsuit. I guess they can sue for damages now, but they certainly can't sue to not let it get out, because it's out. The things that remain unclear at this point regarding Easter and Power is that we don't know if they read every single page themselves or if they relied on subordinate staff for technical reviews of this. You know, it wouldn't surprise me if they simply delegated this away, and that may be their cover at this point to say, never read the report. I know it was my job, but I hired people and I had people at different positions to do that. That was their job. I approved their work, but I didn't approve what they approved, right? I mean, that's the cover they're likely going to go with. I expect to see that. But I will say that it is highly likely, and I think standard for their roles, that both Easter and Power were certainly at least briefed on the existence and major findings of 6 Hour's FMECA document. I can't imagine that something that critical in nature, especially since the requirement came back to say, hey, fix these design flaws, surely these people at the top, Power and Easter, knew of this, right? I mean, they had to have been like, wait a minute, why is SIG going back to the drawing board? Or maybe they knew about it all along, because again, unless this was a requirement that every single gun manufacturer out there had to have faulty stuff, this one would have certainly been singled out. And again, they did reference this by telling them, fix those flaws. So they certainly knew about it. I'm sure there's documents that actually show the federal government acknowledging these failures when they sent the same types of documents back to SIG saying, all right, we want you to fix A, B, and C and make this thing safe. That, to me, is an admission of guilt, right? How did you know about it to tell them to fix it if you didn't know that these things were already happening? Oh, there are a lot of people likely going to be brought into this, probably. But I don't want to see people like Power, Colonel Power, or Miss Easter get away with this and benefit further from this. Again, their careers, whether within the military or within the private sector, both of their careers have benefited from the accolades they received as a result of acquiring the P320, the fast and quick acquisition of implementing this new sidearm into the military. And let's not forget how SIG benefits from this also. You know, anytime there's a military awarding of a contract, that gives, I guess, civilian lore to that particular item. There's a lot of civilian M17s and M18s that were sold out there, and law enforcement assuming that, oh, well, if it's good enough for the military, it's good enough for us. There's a lot of ways to benefit from that. And I'm very curious if somebody's going to do a good enough job to find out if there were personal benefits to Power and Easter during all of this, if they did not receive in some form, one way or the other, whether it's free stuff, whether it's payments, something. I'm very curious that if they could turn their back on this report and actually still implement this firearm, knowing the inherent dangers of it, did they benefit somehow? I think this is super important for us to look at. My biggest concern for putting this video together was, again, not to deflect from SIG, because SIG deserves any kind of blame that it's getting throughout this whole process. But I don't think it's fair for them to get all of it, because somebody was okay with SIG submitting a firearm that you could jiggle or drop and it would have an uncommanded discharge. There needs to be names and faces tied to this. Otherwise, how and who do you hold accountable? You can't sit here and say the name 6 Hour over and over and over again and somebody gets held accountable. You have to identify those people and then hold those people accountable. And you know what? if they're not the ones who did something wrong, whether it was someone above them or below them who either approved it or made it happen, then those are the names that need to be put out there. But names need to be repeated.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America.
He's so horrible!